I died in the year my husband hated me most. Unable to endure his endless silent treatment any longer, I swallowed a bottle of pills and ended my life at the crematorium, watching the flames roar inside the furnace. He allowed himself a rare smile. Someone known as vile as her doesn't deserve to be laid to rest whole. So when the staff handed him the urn, he flipped it over. My ashes scattered across the floor in an instant. All this time, he had believed I was responsible for the death of his first love. That belief was why he had schemed and plotted for years, all for this precise moment of final desecration. When it was over, he stepped over my ashes and walked away without looking back. Though not long after that, he fell to his knees and begged the crematorium to give my ashes back to him. And the news of my death came in. Dan Fanning was signing a contract worth 8 figures. His assistant rushed into his office with a serious expression. "Mr. Fanning, your wife has passed away." The pen paused on the paper. Ink bled out and stained the page. Dan slowly looked up. "She's dead?" "Yes. Police believe it was suicide." The room suddenly fell into a suffocating stillness. Dan was silent for a few seconds before sinking into his chair. As if all the strength had left him, he let out a long sigh. I drifted closer. To my surprise, his eyes were a little moist. The light of the setting sun fell across his face and cast him in that familiar light I used to love so much. However, why was he crying? Were those happy tears? After all, he had waited so many years for this. He had finally avenged Evelyn Wright. Evelyn was his first love. Back in college, they were the golden couple everyone envied. Meanwhile, I was just the useless coward, standing in the background with a silent crush on him. I thought that secret would be buried with me. But later on, Evelyn was diagnosed with a terminal illness. She did not want to become a burden, so she came to me behind his back. Evelyn said she could tell just by the way I looked at him that my love was unconditional and selfless. She asked me to look after him and help him through the worst of it. After she was gone, she chose to disappear to a place no one knew and waited for the end alone. On the day she left, she did not say goodbye. I kept Evelyn's secret, just as I promised. However, Dan believed I was the reason they never got to say goodbye. He believed I must have said something to her that had driven her to that desperate end. He pretended that he had fallen in love with me and acted as though my devotion had finally won him over. He plotted carefully and spared no effort. He professed love, even as he hollowed out my power at the company and sabotaged my ties with my family. When there was nothing left to take, he stopped pretending and told me the truth. He even said he had never loved me. That was really hurtful. When I remembered the coldness in Dan's eyes, a dull ache spread through my chest. When my thoughts cleared, I was already in the car with him. Judging by the direction we were heading, it could only be the crematorium. I did not think he would bother to see me at all. By the time we arrived, the process had already begun. Behind the heavy iron doors of the cremation chamber, the body that had once been warm and alive was burning fiercely. I looked at Dan, who was standing rigid before the observation window. He was staring into the heart of the fire, with an unreadable expression. A staff member approached and asked tentatively, "Mr. Fanning, would you like to take one last look? Number?" His reply was emotionless, "Just burn it thoroughly." A self-deprecating smile made its way to my lips. I tried to touch his face, but my hand passed straight through him. So this was death. Even a touch had become an impossible luxury. I did not know how long the fire burned. When the door finally slid open again, the person who had once weighed nearly 50 kilograms had been reduced to fragments, neatly contained in a small wooden box. Staff member cradled the wooden urn carefully and offered it to Dan with practiced solemnity. "Mr. Fanning, please accept our condolences." He did not take it. Instead, he stared at the photograph affixed to the lid for a few seconds. It was a picture of me, smiling brightly. After I learned the real reason Dan had stayed with me, I stopped taking photos. Even the smiling picture of me had been cropped from a photo of the two of us together. Dan's expression was unnervingly calm. He brushed my picture with his hand. Then suddenly he smiled. "Condolences? Why would I mourn a murderer? I believe someone as vile as her doesn't deserve to be laid to rest whole." As Dan said those words, a blazing hatred flashed in his eyes. He raised his hand and knocked the urn to the floor with a sharp crash. My ashes spilled everywhere like gray snow. "I'm sorry, Mr. Fanning. This is my fault." The staff scrambled in panic to clean it up. However, Dan raised his hand to stop them. "Don't bother. Just sweep it up and flush it down the drain." Then he turned and walked away decisively and coldly. As I watched him disappear, my heart ached as if it were being carved open with a blade. And we had just been together. He could not even bear to see me hurt. Yet he had just spoken such hurtful words without hesitation. Hatred really could make someone cruel. When Dan left the crematorium, dusk had settled in. His face was a cold mask and his back was ramrod straight. It was as if scattering the ashes had been nothing more than an incidental gesture. Just then a familiar figure came rushing toward him. It took me a moment to recognize her. It was Sarah Asen, my college roommate and best friend. She was out of breath. There was sweat beading on her forehead. Her eyes were red, like she had been crying. When she saw Dan, she stopped short. "What are you doing here?" Dan frowned upon seeing her. His tone was cold. "Why are you here?" Still catching her breath, Sarah looked at him with a complicated expression. "I'm here to say goodbye to Emma." "Say goodbye?" Mocking smile touched the corner of Dan's mouth when he heard that. "Then I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. You can't see her anymore." Sarah froze. Her face was drained of color. "What does that mean?" Dan did not answer. He only cast her a dismissive glance, then turned to leave. Sarah had a bad feeling about this. She ran into the crematorium. It was just in time to see a staff member sweeping gray ash into a dustpan with a broom. "What are you doing?" She lunged forward and grabbed the staff member by the arm. Her voice was shaking. Startled, the staff member stammered, "Mr. Fanning told me to." Sarah clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles cracked. She whirled around and bolted back outside. She grabbed Dan just as he was about to slide into his car. "Dan, what is wrong with you? Are you a monster? Emma gave you everything. I've never seen anyone love someone the way she loved you. And this is how you treat her? Let go." Dan flung her hand off. His eyes were glinting with a cold, sharp light. "Loved me? Right from the day she caused Evelyn's death. She should have known that this would be her end." "Nonsense." Sarah's eyes were blazing red. She forced the words out through clenched teeth. "Evelyn's death had nothing to do with." "Shut up." Before she could finish, Dan shoved her hard and cut her off. "Who do you think you are? You have no right to speak Evelyn's name. It seems like I need to teach you some manners on Emma's behalf." Dan made a gesture, and several bodyguards closed in around Sarah. Sarah struggled and tried to say something, but the moment she opened her mouth, someone yanked her by the hair and slammed her to the ground. She let out a muffled cry and curled in on herself. That and fists and kicks rained down on her without pause. "Stop. Leave her alone." I screamed at Dan, but he could not hear me. I tried to stop those guards, only to watch my hands pass straight through their bodies. Again and again. There was nothing I could do. "Dan? Listen to me." Valentine's death had nothing. Sarah tried once more, but a bodyguard struck her heart across the face. Blood spilled instantly from the corner of her mouth. "That's enough, Dan. Sarah is innocent. Please let her go." I screamed in despair, but no one could hear me. He beat Sarah until she was forced to curl into a tight ball, and blood was seeping from the corner of her mouth. Even so, she kept her eyes locked on Dan, as if she were trying to carve his face into her bones. She lay there in a pool of blood. Her breathing was shallow. "You'll regret this one day." "Oh, will I?" Dan seemed almost amused. He tilted his head and scoffed. "I suppose. I'll look forward to seeing how you plan to make me regret it. But for now you'd better worry about yourself." With that his gaze turned icy. He nodded to the side and said, "Get her out of here. I don't want this filth in my sight." At his command, the bodyguards grabbed Sarah by the collar and tossed her onto the roadside, like a piece of trash. I watched it all unfold, feeling powerless. My soul ached, as if it were being torn apart. Dan turned and got into the car. Door slammed shut with a dull thud. With it, that long-buried truth was sealed away once more. As the car pulled away, I took one last look at Sarah. She was lying face down on the ground. Her fingers were twitching slightly, as if she were still trying to push herself up, and agony sharper than any blade twisted inside me. But I could not shed a single tear. Inside the car, Dan leaned against the window. His expression was cold and distant, yet I saw the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his fingers. What was he thinking? Was it regret? Or was the fury still not spent? I did not know. I only knew that even in death the pain had not diminished at all. As I gazed at his stern face, I could not help but murmur, "Dan, how much longer are you going to hate me?" The news of my death spread quickly, through our alumni circles and social feeds. My old college professor, Mr. Carson, sent Dan a message, and he said he had found a box of my things while cleaning out his office, including a few notebooks, a pen, some photographs, and other little trinkets. He asked Dan if he wanted to come collect them as a keepsake. Dan stared at his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. He did not reply. For a long time I hovered beside him. I was certain he would refuse. In his eyes, I had not even deserved to have my ashes intact. What value could a box of old junk possibly hold? However, to my surprise, after a moment of silence, he finally typed out a reply, okay. The weekend. He drove back to the university we had once attended together. The campus was exactly as I remembered it. From the flagstone path beneath the sycamore trees, to the students rushing up the library steps, everything seemed suspended in time. Dan walked toward the administration building. His face was expressionless, yet his steps were slower than usual. His gaze drifted across the familiar scenery, as if searching for something. When Mr. Carson saw him, he sighed and handed over a small cardboard box. These were Emma Dancy's things. She always treasured them. Dan said nothing. He simply looked down and sifted through the contents. There were a few notebooks. His initials were penned on the inside covers. In my careful handwriting, there were some photographs. There was an assortment of little odds and ends. Ever since the day he returned from the university, I had noticed that something was off about Dan. I was dead. He should have felt triumphant. After all, he had hated me for years. He had finally exacted his revenge with his own hands, even going so far as to pour my ashes down the drain. Logically, he should have felt liberated. However, over the past few days he had remained silent. His eyes were hollow. He was distracted even during high-level meetings at the company. His assistant noticed as well. He cautiously said, Mr. Fanning, you haven't seemed yourself lately. Would you like to postpone some of the events in your schedule and take a break? I can arrange flights and a hotel. Dan stared at his computer screen. He was tapping his fingers on the desk absent-mindedly. He was silent for a long moment before finally saying, cancel my meetings for this afternoon and tomorrow. His assistant nodded. Okay, where would you like to go? Make the arrangements right away. Cemetery, he said flatly. I froze a cemetery. Evelyn's grave. However, when Evelyn left back then, no one knew where she had gone. They never even found her body. How could there possibly be a grave? That afternoon, I followed Dan out to a cemetery on the outskirts of the city. He was dressed entirely in black, and there was a small paper bag in his hand. His steps were light, as if he were afraid of disturbing something. When he finally stopped in front of a headstone, I saw the name carved into it. Evelyn. Write me heart sink. Evelyn. Write me heart sink. Grave was new. The area around it was spotless. It was clearly tended to regularly. However, I knew there were no ashes buried beneath it. There were only a few articles of clothing she had once worn. Dan crouched down and gently wiped the photograph on the headstone. His touch was tender, as if he were brushing a lover's cheek. An aching bitterness rose in my chest. He loved her so much. Even with nothing left of her, he had bought this plot and given her a proper resting place. On the other hand, he had knocked over my ashes with his bare hands, leaving nothing behind.
Danchet all pretenses.
Casually pulled 2 bottles of high-proof liquor from the paper bag. Then he sat down on the empty ground beside the headstone. After twisting one open, he lifted it straight to his mouth and took a hard swig. The alcohol burned on the way down. He frowned as he swallowed. He leaned back against the cold stone, and the confusion and sorrow in his eyes grew heavier. Evelyn, I'm here. A soft wind rustled the leaves above, like a whisper that seemed to answer him. He kept drinking and talking to the gravestone. His tone was conversational, yet it carried the weight of a confession. Are you doing all right over there? Oh, I miss you. Standing to the side, I felt an aching pressure in my chest. He drank faster as he rested against the cold headstone. He continued to mumble to himself. His cheeks flushed, his eyes were losing focus. In the end, he was almost slumped over the headstone. His fingers unconsciously traced the edge of the stone as he whispered, Evelyn, I've got my revenge. So why don't I feel happy? His voice cracked as if he had finally run out of strength. He buried his face in his arm. His shoulders were trembling as he cried. I stared motionless. I felt like my heart was gripped by an invisible hand. He was in pain, yet there was nothing I could do. The smell of alcohol clung heavily to Dan from a distance. His assistant saw that he was barely conscious and hurried over. He said carefully, Mr. Fanning, are you okay? Should I take you home? Dan did not answer. He just shook his head vaguely, before letting it lull forward in semblance of a nod. With no other choice, the assistant hauled him to his feet and got him into the car. He collapsed into the back seat. He was breathing heavily. His eyes were half closed. His lips were moving as he mumbled something under his breath. I leaned in closer to make out what he was saying. Then I froze. The name he was calling.
Emma.
It was my name. Emma. The name hung in the stale air of the car, heavy with the stench of whiskey. I hovered over him, staring at his sleeping face. It was the face I had memorized over 10 years of unrequited love, the face that had looked at me with pure loathing just hours ago at the crematorium. Now, in the vulnerability of sleep, his brows were knitted together, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake him from. The assistant, A young man named Marcus froze in the driver's seat. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes widening. He had heard it too. He knew Dan hated me. Everyone knew. To hear Dan call my name with such desperate longing was like hearing a wolf whimper. When the car finally pulled up to the villa, the cold, empty mausoleum that had been our home, Marcus practically had to drag Dan inside. He dumped him onto the sofa in the living room. "Mr. Fanning, I'll get you some water," Marcus said, clearly uncomfortable. "Leave," Dan grunted, waving a heavy hand. "Just leave." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. The door clicked shut, and silence rushed in to fill the space. I watched Dan struggle to sit up. He rubbed his temples, his eyes scanning the room. Habit was a terrifying thing. I saw his gaze drift automatically to the kitchen island, where a thermos of honey water usually waited for him after his social engagements. It wasn't there. His brow furrowed. "Emma," he called out, his voice hoarse. "Water." Silence. "Emma?" He shouted louder this time, a trace of his usual irritation bleeding through. "Stop playing dead. I know you're." The sentence died in his throat. His eyes widened as reality crashed into his alcohol-soaked brain.
She's dead.
"I burned her. I flushed her down the drain." He froze, his hands suspended in midair. I stood right in front of him, screaming silently, "I'm here, Dan. I'm right here. But you made sure I could never touch you again." He slowly lowered his hand. A strange, strangled sound escaped his lips, half laugh, half sob. He slumped back onto the sofa, staring at the ceiling. "Right," he whispered to the empty room.
Gone.
"Good riddance." But he didn't move. He lay there for hours as the moonlight shifted across the floor. He didn't go upstairs to the bedroom we never shared. He stayed on the couch, shivering in the cold air, because the person who used to cover him with a blanket was currently flowing through the city's sewage system. Chapter 2. The Box of Ghosts. The next morning, the hangover was brutal. I watched him stumble into his study, his eyes bloodshot. On his mahogany desk sat the cardboard box Mr. Carson had given him. He sat down and stared at it for a long time. I thought he would throw it away. Instead, he reached out with trembling fingers and opened the lid. Inside lay the artifacts of my pathetic, silent love. There was a dried flower from his graduation corsage, a ticket stub from a movie we watched with a group of friends. I had sat 3 seats away from him, but I kept the ticket anyway. And then the notebooks. He picked up the blue one. It was my diary from senior year. He flipped it open. I wanted to close it, to hide my heart from him even in death, but my ghostly fingers passed through the paper. October 14th. Evelyn looked pale today. She coughed up blood in the bathroom. She made me swear not to tell Dan. She says he has a big exam coming up, and she doesn't want to distract him. It hurts to keep secrets from him, but I promised her.
Dans hand froos.
He reread the entry. November 2nd. Evelyn's condition is getting worse. She told me today that she's leaving. She wants Dan to hate her. She thinks it will be easier for him to move on if he thinks she abandoned him rather than died. She begged me to help her pack. She begged me to take care of him when she's gone. How can I refuse her? She loves him so much. The color drained from Dan's face. He turned the page, tearing the paper in his haste. November 5th. She left today. Dan went crazy. He grabbed my shoulders and shook me, asking where she went. He thinks I said something to drive her away. I wanted to tell him the truth. God, I wanted to tell him so bad. But I saw Evelyn's face in my mind, begging me. So I stayed silent. Let him hate me. As long as he keeps eating, keeps studying, keeps living, let him hate me.
No, then whisper it.
The book fell from his hands onto the desk with a heavy thud. He stood up, knocking his chair over.
No.
This is a lie. You wrote this to trick me. Even from the grave, you're lying. He was panting, backing away from the desk as if the notebook were a venomous snake. Evelyn. Evelyn said you were jealous, he muttered, pacing the room frantically. She said. But he stopped. He tried to recall exactly what Evelyn had said. But all he could remember was her note. Emma will look after you. She loves you more than you know.
Don't look for me.
He had twisted those words. He had filled in the blanks with his own paranoia. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. His hands were shaking so hard, he dropped it twice. Check the hospital records, he barked into the phone, his voice cracking. University Hospital. 10 years ago. Evelyn Wright.
Find out everything. Now.
Chapter 3. The Resurrection of Truth. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of Dan sitting on the floor of his study, staring at a patch of sunlight, drinking straight from a bottle of whiskey. When the email pinged, the sound was like a gunshot in the silence. He crawled to the computer. He opened the file. Patient, Evelyn Wright. Diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Notes. Patient declined further treatment. Discharged against medical advice. There was also a scanned letter attached to her file, authorized for release only to family, or in this case, bought with Dan's influence. It was a waiver Evelyn had signed. Reason for refusing treatment: I want to spend my last days by the sea. I do not want my boyfriend, Daniel Fanning, to see me waste away. Please, under no circumstances, contact him. Dan stared at the screen. The light from the monitor cast his face in a ghostly blue. She was sick, he whispered. She was dying. He scrolled down. There was a nurse's note. Patient's friend, Emma Dancy, collects medication on her behalf. Miss Dancy is providing palliative care at her private residence. The air left the room. You. Dan choked out. He looked around the empty room, his eyes wild. You took care of her? He had accused me of killing her. He had accused me of driving her away with jealousy. Meanwhile, I had been the one cleaning up her vomit, holding her hand while she screamed in pain, and absorbing all of Dan's hatred so he could have a villain to blame. I watched him break. It wasn't a loud scream. It was a collapse. He folded in on himself, his forehead hitting the floorboards. A low, guttural animal noise ripped from his throat. I didn't know, he sobbed into the wood. Emma, I didn't know. You didn't want to know, I thought, looking down at him. It was easier to hate me than to accept she left you. Suddenly, he scrambled up. Sarah. He remembered Sarah. He remembered beating her in the parking lot. Sarah, who had tried to tell him. Sarah, who had said Evelyn's death had nothing to do with her. He ran out of the house. He didn't call a driver. He got into his car, swerving dangerously as he sped toward the hospital where his bodyguards had likely dumped her. Chapter 4. The Price of Silence. Sarah was in a general ward, her leg in a cast, her face a swollen map of purple and blue bruises. When Dan burst into the room, she flinched, terror flashing in her eyes. Get out, she screamed, grabbing the call button. Did you know? Dan ignored her fear. He walked to the bedside, looking like a madman. Did you know Evelyn was sick? Sarah stopped. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. You finally figured out, you son of a bitch, she spat. Dan flinched, as if she had struck him. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't Emma tell me? Because Evelyn made her promise. Sarah shouted, tears streaming down her bruised cheeks. And Emma, that idiot, she loved you too much to break a promise that Evelyn thought would protect you. She thought if you knew Evelyn died in pain, it would destroy you. So, she let you hate her instead. Sarah laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. She spent 10 years atoning for a sin she didn't commit. She cooked for you, cleaned for you, tolerated your affairs, your coldness, your verbal abuse. And how did you repay her? Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than any scream. You flushed her down the drain. Dan staggered back. He hit the wall and slid down it. I want her back, he whispered, looking at his hands. I need to apologize. She's dead, Dan. Sarah screamed, throwing a plastic cup at him. She's gone. You destroyed her body. There is no grave to cry on. There is no urn to hold. You erased her. I can find her, Dan muttered, his eyes unfocused. The drains, the filtration system, surely. You are insane, Sarah said, horror dawning on her face.
He was.
He stood up, his face void of humanity, possessed by a singular, grotesque purpose. He turned and walked out of the hospital, leaving Sarah weeping for the friend she couldn't save. Chapter 5. The Desecration. What followed was the most horrific week of my afterlife. Dan used his money, his 8-figure contract money, to buy access to the crematorium's drainage system. He hired a team of industrial plumbers and forensic specialists. He stood there, in the mud and the filth, wearing a hazmat suit, watching as they sifted through the sludge of the city's waste. The workers whispered. They thought he was a psychopath. They weren't wrong. Mr. Fanning, the foreman said gently on the third day. It's been a week. The water flow. Everything would be in the ocean by now. There's nothing to find. Dan stood knee-deep in gray water. He was holding a sieve. He looked at the foreman with dead eyes. Keep looking. I stood beside him in the muck. Dan, stop, I pleaded, though he couldn't hear. This is disgusting. This is madness. You can't put me back together. He didn't stop until the city shut down his operation due to health code violations. He had found nothing. Not a single speck of bone that could be identified as mine. He returned to the crematorium. He went to the spot where he had flipped the urn. He knelt on the tile floor, scraping at the grout with his fingernails, looking for dust. He found a few gray smears. He licked his finger and pressed it to the dust, then carefully, reverently, wiped the dust onto a handkerchief. I've got you, he whispered, cradling the dirty handkerchief. I've got you, Emma. It was the most pathetic thing I had ever seen. Chapter 6. The Shrine. He didn't go back to work. The board of directors called. He ignored them. The stock price plummeted. He didn't care. He turned our villa into a shrine. He filled the house with photos of me, the ones he had cropped me out of. He hired digital artists to restore them, to put me back into the frame beside him. He slept with my old sweaters. He sprayed my perfume on the pillows. He sat at the dining table and spoke to the empty chair opposite him. "The soup is good today, Emma," he would say, smiling at the air. "I added less salt, just how you like it." I sat in the chair, watching him. "It's too late, Dan," I said. "I can't eat. I can't taste." He would pause as if listening, then nod. "You're right. We should go for a walk later." He was hallucinating. The guilt had fractured his mind. He had created a version of me that was still alive, a version that forgave him. But the nights were the worst. At night, the hallucinations faded, and the cold reality set in. He would wake up screaming, clutching his chest. "It hurts," he would sob, curling into a ball. "Emma, it hurts so much. Is this how you felt? When I ignored you? When I brought other women home? When I killed you?" One night, he found the bottle of pills I had used. There were still a few left. He poured them into his hand. "If I take these," he whispered, looking into the darkness where I stood, "will I see you? Will you be waiting?" I wanted to scream, "No.
Don't come where I am.
You don't deserve the peace I have found." But before he could swallow them, he stopped. He looked at the photo of me on the nightstand, the one where I was smiling. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "That's too easy. I don't deserve to escape." He flushed the pills.
He chose to live.
He chose the punishment of a long, lonely life without me. Chapter 7. The Contract. A month later, Dan emerged from the house. He looked 10 years older. His hair was graying at the temples.
He was thin, gaunt.
He went to his lawyer. "I want to transfer all my assets," he said calmly. "To whom, Mr. Fanning?" "To the Dancy family. Emma's parents." My parents, who had been broken by my death, who had refused to see him at the funeral service he eventually held for an empty casket. "Everything," the lawyer asked, shocked. "Keep enough for small apartment and basic living expenses. Give them the company. Give them the accounts. Give them the villa." He signed away his empire. The empire he had built while neglecting me. The empire he had valued more than my life. He moved into a small, cramping apartment near the cemetery where he had erected a monument for me, a massive stone angel weeping into its hands. It stood next to Evelyn's grave. He got a job as a janitor at the university. Our university. Every day, he swept the flagstone paths where we used to walk. He cleaned the library steps where I used to wait for him. He became a ghost while still alive. Students whispered about the sad janitor, who sometimes talked to himself. One autumn afternoon, I watched him sweeping leaves under the sycamore tree. He paused and looked at a bench. He saw a memory. He saw the young Dan and the young Evelyn laughing, and the young Emma standing behind a tree, watching them with sad eyes. He walked over to the tree. He placed his hand on the rough bark where I had hidden. "I see you now," he whispered. "I finally see you." Chapter 8. The Final Flame. Years passed. I stayed bound to him, a silent observer of his penance. He never remarried. He never smiled. He lived in a state of perpetual atonement. He spent every anniversary of my death at the crematorium, sitting outside the furnace room, just listening to the roar of the fire. He was punishing himself. He wanted to remember the heat. Eventually his health failed. The alcohol abuse from the early years, the stress, the grief, it took its toll. He was lying in a hospital bed, alone. No family. No friends. Just the nurses who pitied him. I drifted closer.
He was old now.
His skin was paper thin. His eyes opened. They were cloudy, but for a moment, they seemed to focus right on me. "Emma," he rasped. This time, I didn't pull away. I didn't feel the hate anymore. I just felt a profound, exhausting sadness. "I'm here, Dan," I whispered. He smiled. A genuine, weak smile. A tear leaked from the corner of his eye. "I'm sorry," he breathed. "I loved you. I was just too blind to see it until I burned it away." His breathing hitched. The monitor beeped, a slow, rhythmic countdown. "Can I?" He reached his hand out, grasping at the air. "Can I come with you?" I looked at his hand. I remembered how he had knocked my ashes to the floor. I remembered the cruelty. But I also remembered the boy I had loved in college. I remembered the man who had spent 40 years sweeping leaves just to be close to my memory. I reached out. My ghostly hand touched his. For the first time since I died, I felt warmth. "Come," I said softly. Dan Fanning closed his eyes. The tension left his body. His hand fell limp. The monitor flatlined. In the void, the fire was gone. There was no pain. He stood before me, young again. The hatred, the anger, the years of bitterness, they had been shed like a heavy coat. He looked at me, uncertain, afraid I would turn him away. I didn't smile. I didn't embrace him. The scars on my soul were deep, and death doesn't erase everything. You have a long way to go, Dan, I said, my voice echoing in the white space. You have a lot to make up for. He nodded, tears shining in his eyes. I know. I have eternity. He took a step toward me, and we began to walk into the mist, not as lovers, but as two souls bound by a tragedy that had taken a lifetime to understand. And back on Earth, in a small, dusty apartment, a breeze blew through the open window, scattering a pile of old, gray dust that had been kept in a handkerchief on the bedside table, finally setting it free.